In the previous lesson, we talked about the growing cities, the industries, the factories, the jobs, and the opportunities, and all the positive aspects. But in today's lesson, we're going to talk about the negative aspects of the industrialization, of more people moving to the cities. We're going to talk about the struggles that many families face living in conditions like these, living in the slums and the tenements. So, in the last lesson, we were talking about industries coming to the city and more people making their way to the city. So, now we're going to talk about how the cities change as the population increases. So, most cities have lots of stuff going on. They have industry and they have lots of things for leisure. And leisure means stuff you do for fun. So, some examples of leisure activities: they started to have theaters, roller skating rinks, dance halls. They also had many retail areas. And retail means a place where you can buy things like businesses. So, how did people get around the cities back then? Cars were not a very common thing, they were only for the richest of the rich people. So, most of the time, people were walking around on foot, which meant you had to live pretty close to where you were going to work. You didn't want to walk 2 or 3 hours. Then, trolleys were invented, and they were basically big wagons pulled by horses, would be like the city buses of back then. They would carry 10 to 15 people, and the horses would pull them through the streets. Sometimes they were called streetcars. So transportation improved when Thomas Edison invented an electric engine for the trolley. Now, this is an improvement for multiple reasons. It makes it so the trolleys or the streetcars are faster, they can carry more people, and they don't produce the waste that all the horses do. So if you can imagine what the streets were like back then, with hundreds of horses going through them all day, it would not be a pleasant smelling place. So these streetcars, where they were built, it wasn't like a car today where you could turn it left and right whenever you want. They had a set path they could go on, similar to a train. And the streetcar routes are going to affect the way the cities grow. People are going to want to live near these routes. They run on a set schedule, and they are relatively inexpensive for people to ride. So now people could live several miles away from where they work. So if you think about that, if we didn't have transportation, I wouldn't be able to work at the school that I do because I live 35 miles away. So this new transportation they had allowed people to travel more easily and live farther away from where they actually worked. So a minute ago I mentioned retail areas. So back then, most of the stores and businesses specialized in only a few types of products. So what that means, if you went to a store looking for men's clothing, you might have to go to one store specifically just to get a pair of pants. And that might be all they do is men's pants. You'd have to go to a different store for shoes, a different store for shirts. So you would spend all day shopping. But then some businesses thought of the idea of putting the stores together into one building. This would be called a department store. And the advantage of that is now you don't have to travel to 100 different places. You could stop at one store and get pretty much everything you need. A guy named F.W. Woolworth created one of the first department stores, and his store was unique because it sold things at a fixed price. And what that means is pretty much everything in the store is going to be this price or less. And his was 5 or 10 cents. So similar to like if you go to the Dollar Tree, everything there is $1. If you went to F.W. Woolworth's, most of his items were 5 or 10 cents. This became very popular with people who didn't have a whole lot of money because they could go there with a budget and know exactly how much they were going to spend. He ends up building one of the tallest buildings in the world, and that's where one of his department stores is. So you got all these people moving to the cities for business, for work, for all kinds of reasons. So what do they do for entertainment? What do they do for leisure? They had opera houses where you could listen to music. They had museums where you could see famous works of art. Sporting events also became popular, and one of the first spectator sports was baseball. And spectator means a sport that people would go and watch. So it was started in 1876, but the problem with baseball is it's a summer sport. So during the winter, people didn't have very much to do. In 1891, James Naismith of Springfield, Massachusetts, made another sport that could be played in the winter called basketball. And the basketball of back then was much different than the basketball of today. Went through lots of changes, lots of different courts, lots of different hoop setups before it became what we know today. So, although the cities had all kinds of exciting things to do, all the people moving there was a problem because the cities were not ready for the population to grow so quickly. That would be similar to if when we go back to school, there's 200 extra kids at school the first day. We're not going to be ready for that. We're not going to have the supplies. We're not going to have enough food to feed everybody. Not going to have enough desks. These cities struggled in many ways because they did not have enough supplies or enough resources for the people. Many of these cities had grown far too quickly, and they didn't have enough places for these people to live. So the landlords built these apartments called tenements. And a tenement is basically the cheapest apartment building possible. It will be one building divided into many different apartments, 30, 40 different apartments. Many of them were only one room. So your entire apartment would be one room. You wouldn't have a kitchen or a bathroom. The bathroom would very often be in the basement, and everybody would share it. So some of these apartments, these tenements, had 30 families living in them. They were very dangerous places because they don't have good ventilation, they don't have windows, they don't have fresh air or air conditioning or running water, and they are very, very crowded. I know a lot of you guys are going stir crazy being stuck at home, not being able to go places, but this is what life was like until about 1920. People living in these tenements had incredibly small apartments with one room for the entire family. 6, 8, 10, or 12 people would share one tiny space, and this would be everything they had. There's no bathroom, there's no kitchen, there's no bedrooms. The only bathroom they have is usually shared in the basement. So imagine being quarantined in a space like this. So a guy named Jacob Rees writes a book about how bad these apartments are and the struggle that a lot of these families are going through. And if somebody just told you how bad it was, you might not understand it. But his book actually had pictures that he had taken of these families and their struggle. His book is called How the Other Half Lives. When people started seeing how bad these tenements really were, a lot of their minds changed. So after his book came out, they made changes. A lot of these tenement buildings were taken down or torn down, and there was changes to the codes where they actually had to have, windows. They had to have bathrooms inside instead of outside. They started building playgrounds for the children to play at instead of, being crammed in these tiny, tiny little rooms. So how were the cities governed? Cities were not prepared for this huge surge in population. Before the Civil War, most people were pretty independent. If they needed water, they would go to the river or they would get it from a well. They had volunteer firefighters to put out the fires, and people got rid of their own garbage. But when the cities got so crowded, there wasn't enough resources for everybody. The cities had to take on some of these responsibilities, and a lot of times they were not prepared for it and unable to meet the needs of the citizens. So the problems are going to increase, and people don't know how to deal with it. One issue is a lot of people don't know much about the new immigrant population, and they are ignorant about them. They assume that these immigrants are living in the slums because they're poor or because they're lazy. And that's not the case. Remember the sacrifices they made to come here. They sold everything they had. They left their home coming to America looking for a place to work, looking to get a better life. So it's not because they were lazy. They were struggling. They were trying to do the best they could. So there was a couple organizations that were set up to help these families, and some examples of them are the Salvation Army, the YMCA, and the YWCA. They realized that many of these families needed help. Okay, guys, if you have any questions, let me know. Send me a message or contact me through Google Classroom. Take a few minutes and knock out the worksheet that goes along with this lesson. It should be pretty easy for you. Have a good day and stay healthy.